So for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Captain Marvel, the overall 21st installment of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and more importantly, is also the first female-led Marvel superhero movie within the context of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and the overall second female-led superhero movie based on a Marvel superhero since the 2005 Daredevil spin-off Elektra, but we don't talk about that movie. And before I begin talking about the overall production of this movie, sometime near the end of Phase 1 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, if you were to ask me what superheroes I would like to see appear in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I probably would have given you the following answers, starting with Black Panther, Doctor Strange, Moon Knight, Man-Thing, Devil Dinosaur, West Coast Avengers, Heroes for Hire, She-Hulk, and Carol Danvers as either Ms. Marvel or Warbird. Now, fast forward several years later during Phase 3 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and so far only a handful of the heroes I've mentioned actually have managed to get their own movies with the likes of Doctor Strange and Black Panther, and to some extent the Heroes for Hire in the form of the Netflix Marvel TV shows. And last but not least, Carol Danvers, but not as Ms. Marvel or Warbird, but this time around as her current comic book persona of Captain Marvel. Since Carol Danvers is kind of like Dr. Hank Pym from the Ant-Man comics, where here's this character that's taken up multiple alter egos throughout the history of Marvel Comics, and it just so happens that Carol Danvers' current alter ego is taking up the mantle of being the second incarnation of Captain Marvel. Now, as for the actual production of the movie, the producers over at Marvel Studios have actually tried to make a movie revolved around Carol Danvers since 2013, but back in those days, the original script was called Ms. Marvel, before she takes up her current mantle of Captain Marvel. And on top of that, the producers actually have expressed interest in creating a solo, female-led superhero movie set within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The problem was, out of all the female superheroes set within the Marvel Comics, which female superhero do they choose to make a solo movie on? And some ideas that were pitched around range from the likes of Black Widow, Pepper Potts, Agent Peggy Carter, along with Carol Danvers as Ms. Marvel, as mentioned a few moments ago. But as time went on, Marvel Studios focused on different projects, wondering how can we bring forth characters like the Guardians of the Galaxy and Doctor Strange onto the big screen, and so on and so forth, eventually ending up with Phase 2 and Phase 3 of the MCU as we know it. And of course, eventually, we would ultimately end up with the MCU's first female-led solo movie, Captain Marvel. And despite the fact that this was a character that I wanted to see on the big screen for some time, I will admit, this was the first MCU movie that I didn't look forward to seeing, for a couple reasons. Reason number one, the combination of promotional material and trailers that have been promoting Captain Marvel have not impressed me in any shape or form. For a simple reason that anytime I see new advertising material for the movie, it has this been there, done that type of vibe to it. And because of how lackluster the promotional material has been for this movie, it didn't get me as hyped up for this movie as much as something like Avengers Infinity War, or any of the other Marvel movies that came out before that movie. Reason number two, the social politics surrounding this movie. Because during the 2010s era of Marvel, in regards to the comic book industry, have produced really bad comic books from what I gathered, since most of the writers are trying to push forward their agenda as opposed to writing a well-crafted story with well-crafted characters. And this made me super worried about this movie. And at first I was like, okay, you know what? This is a movie, and this is made by Marvel Studios. Maybe they won't go in that direction. But when Entertainment Weekly first revealed Brie Larson as Carol Danvers in her iconic Captain Marvel suit with the tagline, "The future is female," that started to worry me, and it just got worse from there on out, resulting in a ton of controversy surrounding the movie, in which both Brie Larson and a couple movie reviewing websites happen to be the primary subject of said controversy, but that's a whole nother topic altogether that I really don't want to get into. But anywho, because of these two factors, I didn't really look forward to this movie to a point that I almost wanted to skip it entirely. Keyword, almost. Because I did indeed end up seeing the movie for 3 reasons. One, I've seen all the other installments of the MCU in theaters, so I might as well continue that streak. Second, I wanted to see how this movie tied in with Avengers Endgame. Reason number 3, I just wanted to give this movie a fair chance and judge it on its own terms outside the influence of both the lackluster advertisement for the movie along with the stupid controversy surrounding it. And with Hollywood producing a lot of female-led action movies as of late, brings up one important question. Is Captain Marvel going to be a good or bad female-led action movie, both in general and for the MCU? As for the plot of this movie, with an intergalactic war being waged by both the Kree and Skrull empires, Kree Starforce soldier Vers is given the task of hunting down a group of Skrulls on a nearby planet. And while on one of her missions, Vers, along with a group of Skrulls, managed to make their way towards a small distant planet known as Earth, in which she, along with S.H.I.E.L.D. agent Nick Fury, joined forces to hunt down the shape-shifting invaders. And as the two proceed with their mission, Vers slowly stumbles upon a conspiracy, as she soon starts regaining old memories from her past life. Can the lone Starforce soldier recover her memories in time, or will the intergalactic war between the Kree and Skrull empires make Earth their final battleground? Now, in terms of what I liked about the movie, I do like the fact that we finally get a female-led Marvel movie after all this time. Not just set within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but set within any Marvel movie in general, because the last time we had a female-led Marvel movie was back in 2005 with the release of the Daredevil spinoff, Elektra, which was so bad that not only did it ruin Jennifer Garner's career, but also killed off the notion of any female-led superhero movies for over a decade. Until the release of the 2017 DC female-led superhero movie Wonder Woman, Captain Marvel, and Black Widow. And I'll say this much, between this and Elektra, Captain Marvel is definitely 10 times better than Elektra, which isn't really saying much considering the fact that their only other competition for a female-led Marvel superhero movie is Elektra. So, at least this movie here is a step in the right direction. Another aspect to this movie that I liked revolves around Samuel L. Jackson playing the role of Nick Fury within the context of this movie for a couple reasons. Reason number 1, using de-aging effects in order to make Nick Fury in this movie look younger than how he usually looks throughout the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I'm not entirely sure if this was done using makeup, CGI, or a mixture of the two, but whatever the filmmakers did, they did a very good job of de-aging Samuel L. Jackson within this one movie to make him look as he did during the mid-90s. Reason number 2, the acting that Samuel L. Jackson does for this depiction of Nick Fury is completely different from how we usually see him play Nick Fury in some of the other MCU movies, for the simple reason that Sam Jackson is playing a younger version of Nick Fury. And despite the script not necessarily being the best thing ever, you can tell that Sam Jackson is at least having fun playing this version of Fury, since Fury in this movie is a lot more energetic than how he usually appears, but he isn't too energetic to a point of being unrecognizable. Reason number 3, seeing Nick Fury interacting with Goose the cat is a highlight of the movie, to a point that if Marvel was to make a short movie or a TV show based around the two, I would totally watch it, and I got a feel I'm probably gonna say that again later in this review. But yeah, Nick Fury hanging out with Goose is definitely a highlight of this movie. And speaking of Goose, much like everybody else, I too found Goose the Flurkin to be a general highlight of the movie, for the simple reason that Goose wasn't just a silly reoccurring gag throughout the movie, but the filmmakers actually took this ridiculous idea for a character and made them play a major role during the last third of the movie in order to move the plot forward, which I found to be very unexpected. Another aspect to the movie that I liked revolves around the technical effects for the entire movie, regardless if it's the makeup used on some of the actors to depict the Skrulls, the costume design, or some of the CGI. Sure, it's pretty standard as far as a Marvel movie is concerned, but it's done very well. To the same degree as Guardians of the Galaxy. Although I think my favorite special effect in the entire movie is showcasing the shape-shifting ability of the Skrulls, because with a group of aliens like the Skrulls, the reptilian shapeshifters, and when I heard this movie was going to include the Skrulls, I just presumed that when they were going to shapeshift into some other form, I thought it was going to be done the same vein as the shape-shifting technique we see from the X-Men movies anytime Mystique is on screen, where you see the scales transform into the clothing physique of the person they're disguised as. With this movie, however, they don't go in that direction. If anything, when you actually see them transform, it almost looks like mold is growing on them, and then the mold kind of takes the shape of the person in clothing they're looking at, which made me happy, since they didn't go the easy route of doing what Mystique did in the X-Men movies. And while on the subject of the Skrulls, I have to talk about the performance of Ben Mendelsohn, who played the lead Skrull, Talos, because if you're someone who's seen Ben Mendelsohn in several other movies, he goes back and forth between using his native Australian accent in some movies, but when he's playing an American character, he has a American accent. So within the context of this movie, I like how the filmmakers utilize both his native Australian accent along with his American accent, depending on what form he takes, because when he's in his regular Skrull form, he uses his Australian accent, and when he's in his human disguise, he ends up using his American accent. But there's this one little moment that I like in particular during the shootout at Project Pegasus where he confronts Nick Fury, and you see him go back and forth between the accents, going from his American to Australian accent, which I thought was really cool. A subtle detail that I don't think many people noticed. Another aspect to this movie that I can appreciate is the fact that the filmmakers were going the same kind of direction as the first Thor movie, in which our lead hero is already pre-established and has their powers, so it doesn't quite follow the traditional superhero origin story. Granted, unlike the Thor movie, the main hero's journey in this one is slowly figuring out who she is, which I think is fine, although I do have some problems with it, which I'll talk about later. And for the last aspect of this movie that I really liked is the way the movie began by having a loving tribute to Stan Lee by making a modified version of the Marvel Studios logo by incorporating all the clips of Stan Lee's various cameos from over the years, creating this living tribute to Stan Lee. As for the next few aspects of the movie, I have mixed feelings towards the actual story itself. Because ever since we were introduced to Ronan the Accuser along with Korath the Pursuer back in the first Guardians of the Galaxy, I always wondered if we would ever see the return of the Kree Empire in a future MCU movie. And when it was announced that this movie would adapt the Kree Skrull War storyline, I was really excited about it, because I feel like there's a lot you could do with this type of story. When I pictured this movie adapting that storyline in my head, I pictured that it would be like an amalgamation of Captain America the Winter Soldier and Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. In that vein of, you have this movie that's this political thriller that's set in space. And given the shape-shifting nature of the Skrulls themselves, this is how I pictured the story. You have Carol Danvers, who's overlooking some peace treaty negotiation between the Kree Empire and the Nova Corps of Xandar. And along the way, she soon discovers that Skrulls have infiltrated both sides. And now she's trying to figure out who's a Skrull and who isn't a Skrull. And along the way, she discovers a conspiracy about herself. But instead, we get this awkward amalgamation of Thor and Man of Steel, in that sense where the main story itself is a fish out of water type of story, but the main hero tries to discover who they are as the movie progresses. So, long story short, on pen and paper, cool idea for a story, but handled with poor execution. Another aspect to this movie that I have mixed feelings towards takes the form of how this movie answers certain questions. Because if you've been following this franchise long enough, you start to form questions around certain characters, key items, and key events. Like, what is the origin to Nick Fury? And is there any unknown history revolved around an item like the Tesseract? And so on and so forth. And this movie does provide answers for those kind of questions. But the problem I have with it is the answers that are given are either really underwhelming, don't make a whole lot of sense, or they're just completely and utterly stupid. and I'll get into some of these facets later in the review. Another aspect of this movie that I have mixed feelings towards is the way this movie goes about the origin story for Carol Danvers, by telling its origin story in the same vein as Man of Steel or Aquaman, in which at the beginning of the movie the character is already pre-established, and as the movie progresses, the character has flashbacks at key moments in her life that somehow influence who they currently are, but outside of the flashbacks, we see how current events affect them too. But the way the movie goes about this style of storytelling is kind of all over the place, because on one hand, when you see Carol Danvers on Earth in the present day, or present day at the time, those scenes and events in terms of how they affect her, I think work. But when we focus on the flashbacks, it's a mixed bag. Like, out of the flashbacks that we see, I only think one of them really works within the context. The scene being when we actually see how Carol Danvers gains her powers, where we hear the character listen to an audio recording which transitions nicely into the flashback itself. And then once the recording is done, we translate nicely out of it. And I thought this was well handled. But as for the other flashbacks, I thought they were kind of all over the place, especially the flashbacks that occur near the beginning of the movie, because I feel like these flashbacks could have been more spread out throughout the movie, and maybe Carol Danvers, while on Earth, finds some kind of item that thinks back to these moments in time. The context makes sense, but it feels rushed. Another aspect to the movie that I have mixed feelings towards are the messages that the movie tries to convey to the audience, which on pen and paper aren't bad, it's just the execution of said messages were severely mishandled, and I can think of two examples. For my first example, it revolves around this scene that occurs sometime before the third act of the movie, where you have Carol and Nick Fury trying to convince Maria to pilot the aircraft into space in order to reach Mar-Vell's laboratory. Maria herself hesitates because she doesn't want to leave her daughter all by herself on planet Earth, but then a few moments later, her daughter comes out saying, "You have a chance to fly the coolest mission in the history of missions, and you're going to give it up to sit on the couch and watch Fresh Prince with me? I think you should consider what kind of example you're setting for your daughter." Now, I get what the scene was trying to say, but I think the way the movie went about its message in that one particular instance was super corny. To a point that the first time I even saw that scene, it literally took me out of the movie because the line of dialogue was just that corny. And this is coming from a person who watches movies that most people would probably consider corny on a daily basis. Now, in terms of how I think they should have handled the scene, maybe you have Carol Nick Fury talking to Maria, and she decides to think on it. Maybe she goes into some other room to get a drink or something, then proceeds to look at a few pictures around the house, seeing how she influences her daughter, then proceeds to accept the mission of her own free will. That, I think, will have conveyed the same idea in a visual kind of way, not through a corny line of dialogue. As for my second example, it centers around the main message of the movie, which is let loose, which isn't a bad idea, but the way the movie goes about it is very redundant. Not because this idea has been done better in several other movies like it, but it's the way the movie goes about this message that doesn't make any sense. Because in any other story in which you see this plot device being used, usually it starts off in one of three ways. First option is that the main character has some kind of object, regardless if it's magical in nature or technological in nature, on them, which suppresses their powers to a point that they can't use them. Second option is that they're being ordered by someone to control themselves in order not to utilize their powers. Or third option, maybe they use their powers by accident and left an emotional trauma to a point that they refuse not to use said superpowers until they actually get control of them later. With this movie, on the other hand, when it comes to the handling of this message, it's done very poorly, because within the first 5 minutes, when we see Carol Danvers training with Jude Law's character, he states that in order to be a good Starforce soldier, you need to not only follow orders, but suppress your emotions in order to suppress your powers. Later in the movie, when we see Carol and Fury escaping the clutches of some of the S.H.I.E.L.D. agents at that one U.S. Air Force base, there's a moment where Fury is talking to Carol about Agent Phil Coulson, and he states that although Coulson's a really good agent, he had to break some rules to do some good, and so on and so forth. thus allowing Carol later to betray the Kree Empire. But here's a problem. Within the first 5 minutes of the movie, it's already kind of established that Carol not only has some control of her powers, but has displayed some emotions, not much, but some emotions here and there, and is something of a loose cannon within the Starforce Brigade. So by the time you have Carol Danvers going Super Saiyan during the climax, you're not really emotionally invested with the message that the movie's trying to convey. In terms of what I disliked about the movie, out of all of the movies set within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Captain Marvel has easily the worst sense of humor that occurs within the franchise. To get an idea of how bad the humor is in this movie, take some of the underwhelming jokes that occur in movies like Black Panther along with Ant-Man and the Wasp, and you essentially get the gist of the humor that occurs in this movie. Because most of the time, the humor is written so poorly that when the joke is about to occur, it has a poor setup, which leads to a poor payoff. And the characters really try to force this joke onto the audience, and it doesn't work. The only parts of the movie that I actually thought were funny were the interactions between Nick Fury and Goose the Cat. If Marvel made a movie or a 30-minute special just revolved around Nick Fury playing with Goose the entire time, I'd totally watch it. But perhaps the funniest part of the entire movie was reading through the credits and seeing that it took 4 different cats to play the role of Goose. And if I'm laughing more at the fact that it took 4 different cats to play the role of Goose the Cat in the movie, that says a lot about how bad the humor is in Captain Marvel. Another problem that I have with the movie revolves around the soundtrack for both the instrumental and the collection of 90s pop songs that periodically play throughout the movie, starting with the instrumental soundtrack, because out of all of the Marvel movies to have a instrumental soundtrack, this is bar none the worst of the bunch. The instrumentals in this movie is so bad, I completely forgot this movie even had music playing in the background. The soundtrack to this movie is so non-existent. It didn't occur to me the movie even had a soundtrack until the last scene of the movie, where we see Nick Fury typing up the Avengers Initiative document on his computer, and we start hearing Alan Silvestri's Avengers theme playing in the background. Now, let that sink in. If it took a musical cue that came from another Marvel movie to even register that this movie even had a soundtrack to begin with, just shows how non-existent the soundtrack is for this movie. Then you have the collection of various 90s pop songs that play throughout the movie, and when these songs play in the background, it just doesn't work with the movie for a couple reasons. The first and primary reason as to why this soundtrack fails revolves around Guardians of the Galaxy, because you can clearly tell that the people behind the soundtrack for this movie were trying way too hard to emulate the soundtrack to Guardians of the Galaxy. But here's the difference between the songs that we hear in Guardians of the Galaxy and the songs that we hear in Captain Marvel. With Guardians of the Galaxy, the soundtrack fits naturally into the movie, since Peter Quill not only grew up with those songs, but he also has a personal connection with them because of his mother, and the soundtrack in and of itself becomes a major character within the movie that contributes to the story in meaningful ways. With the music that we hear in this movie, it's the complete opposite effect. Unlike the music that's associated with Peter Quill throughout Guardians of the Galaxy, the music that's associated with Carol Danvers in this movie makes no sense in terms of how it connects with Carol Danvers and contributes to the story. The movie treats it as if Carol had a personal connection with these songs, but in reality doesn't, since she spent a few years on the Kree homeworld of Hala. Therefore, there is no way in hell she could have experienced these songs while on the Kree homeworld. Also, when you do hear these songs playing in the background, not only do they make the movie dated, but the context in which they are used in are very on the nose. Another problem that I have with the movie are the various continuity errors that occur throughout the movie. The first continuity error revolves around the S.H.I.E.L.D. organization itself. because this movie takes place in 1995, and Nick Fury refers to the organization as S.H.I.E.L.D. Fast forward to the events of the first Iron Man movie, and Phil Coulson refers to the organization by its full name. Now, the problem here is that in the events of the first Iron Man movie, when we are first introduced to Agent Phil Coulson, anytime you see him talking to characters like Tony Stark or Pepper Potts, a running gag throughout the entire movie revolves around Phil Coulson referring to the S.H.I.E.L.D. organization by its full name. And you got some of the other characters sitting there saying, man, that's quite a lengthy name. And you would often reply with, yeah, we're trying to figure something out. And by the time you get to the end of the movie, there's this conversation going on between Pepper Potts thanking Phil Coulson, and there's a point in time where she tries to say the full name of S.H.I.E.L.D., but Phil Coulson interrupts her by saying, just call us S.H.I.E.L.D., implying that's the first time the S.H.I.E.L.D. organization was referred to as S.H.I.E.L.D. So why is it that Nick Fury in this movie refers to the S.H.I.E.L.D. organization by its acronym as opposed to its full name? Then you have the MCU continuity points revolved around alien invasion plots. Because the movie goes out of its way to basically set up the idea that the Skrull invasion is the real reason as to why Nick Fury wanted to make the Avengers Initiative in the first place, which makes no sense. In the first Avengers movie, you have that one scene where Tony Stark, Bruce Banner, and Steve Rogers confront Fury about the Phase 2 weapons, demanding, what's the deal with these weapons? Nick Fury then goes on this whole tangent about, because of the events of the first Thor movie where Thor battled the Destroyer, I came to the realization that we're not the only ones out there, and I'm building these weapons to prepare ourselves in case if an alien invasion ever occurred, which eventually leads to the climax revolved around the Avengers battling the Chitauri alien forces in New York City, which has this ginormous ripple effect that influences future installments of the MCU. And when you do watch some of these future installments, the battle for New York City is guaranteed to be brought up in some shape or form, with many characters saying, guys, this was a wake-up call. This is the first time Earth has ever been invaded by aliens. We need to be better prepared. And here's the problem that I had with Nick Fury between this movie and the first Avengers movie. By the time this movie came to an end, Nick Fury is fully aware that aliens exist in this universe, which contrasts with the Nick Fury that appears in the first Avengers movie, because in that movie, Nick Fury isn't aware that aliens exist in this universe until Thor, Loki, and the Chitauri show up. Then you have the plot hole that's revolved around the Tesseract, because between Captain America the First Avenger and Avengers, we are under the assumption that the Tesseract has been in S.H.I.E.L.D. custody between the end of World War II up until the aftermath of the Chitauri invasion. So why is it that when we first see the Tesseract, it's in a spaceship that's around Earth, but not on Earth itself, in S.H.I.E.L.D. custody? Seriously, this is just asking a bunch of questions that are never gonna get answered. And yeah, I could go on about the Tesseract being in this movie, but seriously, I think you get my point in regards to how this movie handles continuity within the MCU. Another problem that I have with the movie revolves around the pacing, because it's all over the place. Like, if I had to break down the pacing for each act in the movie, the pacing in the first act moves at a very slow pace, since the first act of the movie is nothing but clunky exposition that's handled really awkwardly, to a point that I started to lose interest in the movie right away. In the second act of the movie, the pacing is a lot better, since the movie takes its time getting from one plot point to another. Then you have the third act of the movie, which moves at a much slower pace than the second act of the movie, but it's nowhere near as slow as the first act. Another problem that I have with the movie revolves around the fight scenes, because out of all the fight scenes that occur throughout the entire movie, I only thought 2 of them were good. The 2 fight scenes in question are the ones that occur on Earth, between the chase scene that takes place on the train to the shootout that occurs at Project Pegasus. Because between these 2 action sequences, they have good pacing, good setup, good editing, good lighting, and you can tell where characters are in relationship to one another. And the thing that makes these fight scenes great is tension. since the fight scenes in question revolve around the Skrulls shape-shifting as people in these particular locations. So you have Carol Danvers and Nick Fury trying to figure out who's a Skrull and who's human. As for the rest of the fight scenes, I think they're terrible, because unlike the previous two fight scenes that I just talked about, the other fight scenes that occur throughout this movie are bad for the following reasons. The fight choreography isn't that good, the pacing is sporadic, there's shaky camera angles like that of the type of shaky cam you see in The Bourne Ultimatum, and the lighting is way too dark to a point that I can barely see what was going on, and there was just no tension at all. Honestly, I have an easier time following a Michael Bay Transformers fight scene than the fight scenes that occur in this movie, with the exceptions of the two action sequences that occur on Earth. Then you have the final battle, and in my opinion, the final battle that occurs in this movie, I think is one of the worst, if not the worst final battles I've seen, both within the context of the MCU and outside of the MCU, because it's very anticlimactic. I'm going to list a few reasons as to why I think this final battle is so anticlimactic. Reason number one, much like Black Panther, the actual climax to this movie does not look like a scene from an actual movie. It looks like a cinematic cutscene from a PS3 video game. Now sure, I do think that the graphics themselves look 10 times better than the final fight in Black Panther, but it still looks like a CGI cutscene. Reason number two, the actual fight choreography itself is really boring to look at, since it just consists of nothing but Carol Danvers flying through the vacuums of space, shooting proton beams at some spaceships with relative ease. Again, using a video game comparison, it's like the person playing the video game decides to insert a cheat code that grants them unlimited health and invincibility before taking on the final mission, and beating said mission with relative ease. Reason number three, on top of having a non-existent external conflict, the climax for Carol Danvers has no internal conflict. Like, what is her internal conflict? Nothing that I could think of. Now, let's compare Carol's internal conflict with Diana's internal conflict from Wonder Woman. Now sure, I have many problems with the climax that occurs in Wonder Woman, and I think that the external-internal conflict for Diana could have been handled a lot better. But here's the thing, Diana at least had some kind of internal conflict during that climax on two different occasions. The first occasion being her fight with General Ludendorff, since Diana believed General Ludendorff was really Ares, and by killing him, this would stop World War I. But upon killing General Ludendorff, she notices that the fighting still continues, resulting in Diana's inner belief being completely and utterly shattered, resulting in her now trying to make the hard decision of whether or not she wants to continue to fight for humanity. Now, granted, the movie does let her off the hook by fighting the actual Ares, resulting in a very similar internal conflict, but done more out of love. Again, Diana, during that last third of the movie, at least had an internal conflict. With Carol Danvers, on the other hand, she actually does have an internal conflict for the first 2/3 of the movie while she's hunting the Skrulls, which is, who am I and what is my origin? Which, for this type of movie, makes sense for her character since she had amnesia. My problem with it is this internal conflict wraps itself up in between the end of the second act and the start of the third act. So during a climax, I don't really think she has an internal conflict. Now, I get as to why she's battling this huge armada of spaceships, but I feel that the internal conflict that occurs here could have been handled a lot better. As for the next few problems that I have with the movie, in some shape or form, revolve around Nick Fury. The first problem being the origin of how Nick Fury lost his left eye. Because Nick Fury, no matter if you're reading the comics or watching some TV shows, in some shape or form he's always lost his eye. But it's usually through like some kind of confrontation with another character. And the origin that I imagined for Nick Fury losing his left eye in this continuity would be kind of reminiscent to that of the Nick Fury that appears on the Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes animated TV show, where he was on some routine mission and he gets into a really intense gunfight with the Winter Soldier and loses his left eye due to an explosion or something. which I think could work for the MCU incarnation of Nick Fury. And when it was announced that Nick Fury would play a major part in this movie, I sat there thinking, oh, this actually might make some sense. Because in Captain America Winter Soldier, when Nick Fury removes his eye patch for the first time, he says the following lines of dialogue: "You need to keep both eyes open." And the first time I heard that quote in Winter Soldier, it gave me chills. And given that this movie includes the Skrulls, that also made sense to me. I was like, oh, so he's going to lose his left eye to a Skrull encounter. And at first, it looks like they're going in that direction, but it was only mere foreshadowing for later in the movie. And when we do see Nick Fury lose his left eye, it wasn't to a Skrull, it was to him playing with Goose. And at that exact moment, it single-handedly became the dumbest moment in the entire MCU. And now, when I'm going to be watching Captain America Winter Soldier from now on, I'm not going to get chills from Nick Fury saying, "You need to keep both eyes open." I'm going to cringe when he says that. Then comes the origin of how Nick Fury came up with the Avengers Initiative. The way I pictured the MCU incarnation of Nick Fury coming up with the Avengers Initiative went something like this. Maybe during Nick Fury's early days at S.H.I.E.L.D., he learns about the missions that Captain America took part in during World War II. And maybe upon looking at further material focused on Captain America, maybe he discovers there are several other files based on people and events that occur throughout the Marvel Cinematic Universe, from the likes of learning about the Hank Pym Ant-Man, to looking at newspaper clippings that revolve around the disappearance of a Peter Quill, to finding unusual corpses in Norway. And then comes up the idea of, maybe I should gather some of these individuals and form a team. And then looks back at Captain America and says, you know what, you're the first Avenger, so I'll name this whole entire team after you. Because after all, Captain America, chronologically speaking, is the first Avenger, and he's had the most influence on the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. In terms of how the movie goes about it, Nick Fury takes influence from the events of the movie, and he actually types up a document that says the Protectors Initiative, but then he looks at a picture of Carol Danvers next to her plane, and on her plane it says Carol Avenger Danvers, which I already have a problem with, which I'll explain later. And then he's like, you know what, I'm gonna call this the Avengers Initiative. And the problem that I have with Nick Fury taking inspiration from Carol Danvers in regards to coming up with the Avengers Initiative has to do with poor script writing, for a couple reasons. Reason number one, the numerous plot holes that occur throughout the entire movie. But I already talked about the plot holes that occur throughout this whole movie, so moving on. Reason number two, out of all the movies to be released in the Phase 3 lineup of the MCU, this script feels so out of place due to its experimental nature. Because when you really look at the Phase 1 of the MCU compared to Phase 3 of the MCU, Phase 1 was very experimental, since the producers over at Marvel Studios had no idea how to perfect the formula. By the time you get to Phase 3, they've mastered the formula, thus leading to a bunch of movies that feel so much more refined in comparison to the movies that came out in Phase 1. But when you look at Captain Marvel in comparison to all the other movies that came out in Phase 3, it feels very out of place to a point that it feels more like a Phase 1 movie as opposed to a Phase 3 movie. And like I said at the very beginning of this review, the producers over at Marvel Studios have tossed around the idea of making a movie focused on Carol Danvers back in 2012, 2013. And according to some sources, supposedly a script for Captain Marvel was completed back in 2013. And keep in mind, the movie wasn't announced until maybe late 2014 or 2015. So maybe that's why the movie feels so experimental. Whether or not they made any revisions to the script since then is completely unknown. Which leads into reason number 3, the inclusion of Carol Danvers herself and trying to find a way to make her fit naturally within the Marvel Cinematic Universe this late into the franchise. Because even though chronologically speaking this movie takes place in the 90s, way before the events of the first Iron Man movie, but as far as the movie's release schedule is concerned, I feel like this movie came out way too late in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Because on one hand, if this movie came out in the late stages of Phase 2 or the early stages of Phase 3, I don't think we would have this problem. However, because Captain Marvel is being released so late in the Phase 3 lineup of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, especially in between two gigantic movies like Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame, which puts a ton of pressure on the filmmakers since they're trying to find a way to naturally incorporate Carol Danvers into this cinematic universe, which results in a movie that not only has numerous plot holes, but several retcons that destroy key moments for future Marvel movies, among other problems, which results in a movie that tries way too hard to incorporate a new character that was shoehorned in at the last second, or what feels like the last second, into a pre-existing universe and try to take all that material and find a way for said existing material to fit around Carol Danvers so that she can become a focal point for future installments of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, going back to the whole Carol Avenger Danvers thing, honestly, this is more of a nitpick than anything else, but I feel like this was a missed opportunity. Because sometime before the beginning of the third act, her best friend Maria Rambeau stated that her nickname in the Air Force was Photon, which is a nod to her daughter's comic book counterpart where she becomes a superhero known as Photon. That made sense to me. With Carol Danvers, on the other hand, given the nickname of Avenger, not so much. Because on one hand, I feel that this was a missed opportunity to have Carol Danvers' nickname in the U.S. Air Force be Warbird, since that was one of her older personas in the comics, way before she took up the mantle of Captain Marvel. And second, I feel that the reason as to why she was called Avenger at that exact moment had to do with sloppy writing that I just mentioned several minutes before. But like I said before, this is just a nitpick I have with that nickname. And of course, like many other movies set within the MCU, Captain Marvel also has a villain problem. And in my humble opinion, out of all of the villains to appear in any movie set within the MCU, the main villain of this movie, hands down, is by far the worst. The villain in question being the great intelligence of the Kree Empire. Like, people say that Malekith the Accursed is one of the weaker villains. Honestly, I remember more about Malekith the Accursed from Thor the Dark World than I do about the villain that appears in this movie. Seriously, when this character reappeared again during the last third of the movie, I completely forgot this character even existed in the first place. And to add on top of that, this movie also marks the chronological first appearance of MCU villains like Ronan the Accuser, along with his second in command, Korath the Pursuer. And these two characters are just wasted in the movie, to a point that you could write them out of the script and nothing would change. Also, there are some things that don't make any sense to me, like the helmet that Carol Danvers wears in certain situations, because it's established that Carol Danvers' suit has this helmet, which allows her to survive in extreme environments like outer space or being underwater. Yet, at the very end of the movie, when we see her floating in space, she's not wearing the helmet. Granted, from what I gathered, this is something that occasionally happens in the Carol Danvers run as Captain Marvel in the recent comics, but it still doesn't make any sense within the movie. Also, I don't know if it's me, but I think the helmet that she wears throughout the movie just makes her look stupid. Also, if Carol Danvers in this continuity has been around since the mid-90s, then why is it that characters like Thor, the Asgardians, Nova Corps, Guardians of the Galaxy, Thanos, Ego the Living Planet, the Ravengers, or any other character that resides from space talk about her existence? Because at the end of the movie, Carol Danvers makes the decision to go on more space adventures, and you would think that all of these characters in some shape or form would bring her up, but they don't, or have yet to, pending on how Avengers Endgame plays out. Also, if Carol Danvers told Nick Fury only to contact her in case of emergencies, how come Nick Fury didn't actually contact Carol Danvers during an event like the Chitauri invasion of New York City, or really any other world-ending event between the first Avengers movie and Avengers Infinity War? The most likely explanation that I can think of is probably due to poor writing, as I mentioned earlier, because this movie is being released so late in the Phase 3 lineup of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but I've already said my piece on poor script writing, so moving on. And for the last problem that I have with the movie revolves around our main hero, Carol Danvers herself, for two different reasons. Reason number one, she just feels like comic sloppy seconds, conceptually speaking, because let's really look at Carol Danvers as a whole. She at some point was a part of the US Air Force, kinda like War Machine. She's very cold and emotionless, but once in a while can be snarky, like Black Widow. And when it comes to conversing with other characters to form a battle plan of sorts, she has a no-nonsense type of attitude, like Hope Van Dyne, and she's able to fly around and shoot beam-like projectiles from her hands, like Scarlet Witch. And here's the thing, on pen and paper, this sounds like a really great idea for a character, but the execution, I think, is handled very poorly. Which I find to be really surprising, because before Carol Danvers ever entered the Marvel Cinematic Universe, this franchise has produced some really good female characters, ranging from Black Widow, Gamora, Hope Van Dyne, Scrapper 142, the Ancient One, Nebula, Mantis, and so on and so forth. Yet, when we get introduced to Carol Danvers in this movie, it feels like a huge letdown, which is so bizarre, because most of their female characters up to this point have been really good. Like, what the fuck happened here? Were the filmmakers under such huge pressure of making a female-led MCU movie that they became victims to said pressure, resulting in the movie that we have before us? Reason number two, Brie Larson's acting for Carol Danvers. I don't even know where to begin here, because I'm gonna be honest, I haven't seen Brie Larson in too many movies. Like, the only two movies I've ever seen her in are Scott Pilgrim vs. the World and Kong Skull Island, so that's as much of her acting range that I'm familiar with. If I had to describe Brie Larson's acting for Carol Danvers in this movie, it's very dull and wooden. Now, I get that Carol Danvers in the movie has amnesia, so she doesn't quite know who she is as a person, but the acting could have been a lot better. If I had to really describe her acting in this movie, using one of the two movies I just mentioned a few moments ago, it's kind of reminiscent to that of Envy from Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, but there are some major differences between Carol Danvers and Envy. With Envy, she's a support character who doesn't have that much screen time in the movie, and although she is a cold, emotionless bitch, you can at least tell that Brie Larson was having a blast playing this character. With Carol Danvers, on the other hand, this is not a support character. This is the main character of the movie that we spend a good majority of the time with. And when you do see Brie Larson playing this character, it doesn't feel like she's having fun with the role. She seems more bored by it than anything else, and only signed on to play the character to get a paycheck. And if that is indeed the case as to why Carol Danvers is so cold and emotionless, why should I bother investing in the character? Seriously, I find myself more emotionally invested with Goose, who is a alien cat, than the flesh and blood human that is Carol Danvers. Granted, it could be possible that maybe Brie Larson was given a poor sense of direction by the filmmakers, or maybe Brie Larson wasn't the right choice to play Carol Danvers, but we'll just have to see how the character fits in with Avengers Endgame. And if the Russo brothers are able to make vast improvements on Carol Danvers in that movie, then it just could have been a poor sense of direction. But if it's Brie Larson herself, maybe the producers should have picked a different actress to play the role. So, for my final verdict of Captain Marvel, while this movie's definitely better made than most female-led superhero movies that came out during the early 2000s, which isn't really saying much considering the fact that most female-led comic book superhero movies were terrible. And as far as this movie is concerned, it's just several notches above those movies, because the filmmakers tried to find a way to incorporate this movie into the franchise naturally, but in doing so, they shoehorned this character way too late into this franchise to a point that this singular movie created plot holes that were never there to begin with. Not only making it the worst installment of the Phase 3 lineup of the MCU, but making it the worst installment of the MCU in general. So overall, Captain Marvel tried to be the MCU equivalent to Wonder Woman, but ended up becoming the MCU equivalent to Man of Steel instead. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Captain Marvel? So it looks like the movie got generally mixed reception, and that's if these scores aren't fixed in some shape or form. And so for my final rating of Captain Marvel, I give it a 2 out of 5, which is disappointing, considering that at the beginning of this review, I stated that I always wanted to see the character of Carol Danvers appear on the big screen, just not in her Captain Marvel persona. Which begs the question, when you think of Carol Danvers from the comics, what older persona of hers do you think of first? And see you later.